Thank you, Ryan, for that incredibly kind introduction. Thank you, Shmuley. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I know I ran a tiny bit late getting here, so I'm going to try not to talk for too long so that we have plenty of time for 17 consecutive questions about the sequel to Dune, the Silmarillion. I mean, really, like any major work of deep nerd literature that you guys want to talk about, I'm at your disposal. But it was suggested that some sort of combination of the personal and the political, or the personal and the national, or whatever, would be welcome. So I'm going to try to talk for a minute fusing those two. And what I want to talk about tonight for a bit is the question of sort of the weirdness and instability of the ordinary, normal world in which all of us, especially at a place like Yale University, tend to live our lives and take for granted and so on. And this is a question that I think about a lot these days, because one of my core views of the last 10 or so years of Western history is that you can understand a lot of trends if you don't think about them necessarily in terms of an axis of left and right, liberalism and populism and so on, but if you think of them in terms of normalcy and weirdness, that we've lived through a period of what you might call deep weirdening, a highly technical term that I hope you all write down and take home with you, over the last decade or so. And I'm quite curious to see just how far it goes. I think there's sort of a push and pull of these things in human history, and usually you get sort of a wave of weirdness and then the restoration of normalcy. But I'm honestly quite curious to see just how far this particular wave of weirdness goes. And I think part of why I have a strong interest in these things is that my whole childhood was lived in a kind of liminal space in between the normal and the weird, or in between what was normal for Southern Connecticut, where I grew up, right around here, and what was present but quite abnormal, again, at least for the background that I came from. So I grew up here. My parents were from Maine and California, respectively. They met at graduate school in the Bay Area in the late 1970s. I was born in San Francisco in 1979, but then they moved back east very quickly, but undoubtedly carrying some tiny element of the weirdness of San Francisco in 1979 back to the East Coast with them. And so we ended up settling sort of accidentally right around here. We lived in Branford for a little while. We lived on Bradley Street, actually, just over there when I was 4 or 5 years old. And my father was a lawyer, and my mother had been a graduate student in English and intended to be a writer. And they had gone to Yale. My mother was in the first class of women, and my dad went to Stanford. And so on the surface, I was having a very, you could say, sort of conventional meritocratic upbringing. We were sort of mildly religious. We went to the Episcopal Church, which is where you went in the 1980s if you were mildly religious. Fewer people do that anymore, but it was still a thing. Sort of very, very conventional mainline Protestantism still existed in some viable form when I was a small child. But there were some elements of weirdness in my life. My mother had some strange chronic illnesses, allergies, and various other things that didn't have a clear diagnosis. And my parents were, connected in some vague way, at least, to sort of countercultural currents, sort of Californian ways of thinking, I guess you could say. And so we went off on these forays when I was a kid. We ate a lot of health food, for instance, long before health food was cool, before there was Whole Foods, before there was anything remotely like Whole Foods, when in order to acquire tofu, you went to some tiny hole-in-the-wall health food store, probably in Guilford, Connecticut, not too far. Some distant cousin some black sheep of Patrick's family, in a Jerry Garcia Grateful Dead t-shirt, would sort of shuffle out of the back, and you'd buy your tofu by the cube, like the way they used to pull huge blocks of ice from New England ponds in the winter and ship them in sawdust around the world. This was how you acquired tofu. So yeah, we were sort of in that world. There was a restaurant we went to in Middletown that actually still exists. Not surprisingly, it still exists. It's thriving. It's called It's Only Natural. You can drive up to Middletown and have a vegetarian meal there. But back in the day, it was a little shabbier, but it shared space with a New Age bookstore. So we would eat our tempeh and our veggie burger, and then we'd sort of wander next door, and all the books had titles like Women Who Run with the Wolves. And so you would think, based on this, that we had a nice shout out to witchcraft here, that I would have grown up to become a fine, upstanding warlock or something with a sideline in aromatherapy. But in fact, the more important thing that we did when I was a kid was attend charismatic healing services. That my mother had a friend who said, "Oh, you have these illnesses that you struggle with. Why don't you come with me?" There's a woman who does faith healing, basically. And for reasons that, for some reason, did not fall afoul of separation of church and state issues, these services were held in high school auditoriums around here. Maybe the first one I went to was in Milford, usually on Saturday nights, and there was sort of a Christian rock band atmosphere. And the woman whose name was Grace, because that was, of course, her name, was a very sort of, northeastern, greater New York City Italian-American woman with, jet black hair and strong lipstick and so on, who would sing. She was a great singer, and she would go around in the crowd and sort of pick people out and say, you in this aisle, you're suffering from this, you have back problems, you have this, you have that. And she'd pray for them or touch them on the forehead. And they would, most of the time, and by most of the time I mean like 95% of the time, they would fall backwards to their own shock often and land on the floor and have some kind of either minor or major mystical experience. Totally normal stuff. And my mother, who again was sort of religious, but not like, not a charismatic healing service kind of religious person, had such an experience on her first visit and kept having these experiences, and so we kept going to these services, and from there we sort of spent, a period of 10 to 12 years as a family, sort of balancing a kind of residual commitment to Episcopalianism with a lot of time spent in sort of Pentecostalist and evangelical worlds. We drove all the way to Toronto when I was like 12 years old for there's this Pentecostalist denomination, to the extent you can call it a denomination, sort of loosely affiliated churches called the Vineyard. There's still one in New Haven, and there was one in an airport just off like an airport access road in Toronto, and they had some kind of crazy, in 19th century American terms, you would call it a revival. They would have called it, a move of the Holy Spirit, where you went and instead of it being sort of, as in the healing services I was familiar with, one person who was sort of the locus of the service, it was like the Holy Spirit was sort of like a ball of energy that was being passed around, and you had people falling down, you had people singing, you had people roaring like lions and running around the room, and I was, do you know that, some of you are, the Homer Simpson meme where he's diminishing into the shrubbery. Are you familiar with that? Yeah, so I was like 13 at this point. So picture me diminishing into the shrubbery of the, Canadian adults roaring like lions. But yeah, so that was sort of our, that was our sort of religious, spiritual background when I was a kid. And yet somehow all of this coexisted with my going to the most normal of the private schools in the greater New Haven area, sort of, entering into sort of a very normal, secular, meritocratic, upper middle class ladder of success. along with the weird stuff was for the weekends. The macrobiotic camp that we went to in a small college in Vermont for a week and a half, where my parents were like, we're just here for the food. All the lectures were like, how you can attain immortality by only eating brown rice. And my parents were like, we're just here for the food. So yeah, so I always had a sort of slightly doubled existence where I was sort of conscious of myself as sort of a nice young meritocrat who got good scores on the SAT and got into Harvard, but also had this sense of a sense that the world was a stranger place, that human experiences were stranger, but also whatever was connected to human experiences were stranger than what was sort of manifest in the very normal, moderate, liberal education that I was getting. And when I entered into professional life, I went to Harvard and I edited the conservative newspaper there, and in an anticipation of my entire life, I was the token conservative columnist for the Harvard Crimson. It's been a nice run. And I went from there into journalism. I got a job at The Atlantic. I moved to Washington, D.C. shortly after 9/11. And I definitely found it was an advantage in my professional life to have had these kind of experiences. In part, it was an advantage just because I knew a fair amount about religion, which, journalism has a reputation as a secular profession for a reason. There are a lot of religious people who think that journalists are out to get them, and most of the time the reality is that journalists just don't know anything about religion at all. But also often they're aware of their deficiencies, and so I undoubtedly was able to, gain several important promotions in my professional life just by being able to, adequately explain the difference between the Immaculate Conception and the Virgin Birth, or other crucial distinctions. But it also gave me sort of a strong connection to not all of the worlds, but some of the worlds that exist sort of fully outside the normal ladder of secular ambition. So for a certain portion of my career, I thought of this as sort of like my advantage, my ace in the hole, my sort of sense of, a sense of things that not everyone in my profession shared. But at least for a certain period of time, it also felt like the kind of knowledge of the world's weirdness that I had amassed wasn't going to be like that useful when it came to understanding the trajectory of early 21st century America. As I said, I graduated right after September 11th, and I'd say there was a period, a serious period in American intellectual life where the combination of September 11th and then the failures of George W. Bush's presidency, the failures of the Iraq War and its aftermath, encouraged a kind of, a sort of, I don't want to call it like an Enlightenment triumphalism exactly, but there was a sense that was manifest in sort of new atheist figures like, Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett, that sort of, was connected to trends in liberalism that basically said, look, we just sort of lived through these two atavisms, the atavism of radical Islam and the atavism of George W. Bush's, cowboy evangelicalism. And, the intersection of those things delivered us to disaster in various ways. But fortunately, as a society, we are moving beyond them. We're sort of leaving the age of conservative religion in America behind. Radical Islam, was seen as this sort of, for a brief period after 9/11, as this kind of potential rival to the West on the scale of Soviet communism or Nazi Germany, right? There were a lot of people who made those arguments. And then it seemed to dissolve for a time back into, look, this is small bands of terrorists, living in the mountains, and, they're a threat, but one that one that the modern world can handle, right? And so there was this period really through, I'd say, the first term of Barack Obama, where, the perception was, that essentially the huge ideological battles of the past were gone and not coming back, that traditional religion in various forms was, weakening as a force in the Western world, and that the future belonged to sort of liberal technocracy, right? That was sort of the spirit of Obama's first term, and that was sort of the defining spirit of the world in which I got my job at the New York Times. And I remember when I got my job at the Times, subsequently there have been situations where the Times has hired conservatives, for instance, when they hired my colleague Bret Stephens from the Wall Street Journal, and there's been sort of a powerful negative reaction from part of the Times's readership to this guy has said this thing about climate change or that thing about this, and there's been sort of a wave of criticism. When I was hired, there wasn't really anything like that, and partially it was that I was completely unknown. I was like 13 years old, and I think this was sort of by design, that my predecessor had been Bill Kristol back when Bill Kristol represented something very different than Bill Kristol represents today. But he had sort of been very unpopular with the Times readership, and so it was like, all right, they've hired this younger guy who, isn't connected to the Iraq War or any of these debates. But I think there was also sort of just this spirit of tolerance and generosity towards the kind of antiquated views of a few benighted young fogies who, still think there's something of interest in religion. Isn't that very nice? But, it's not a big deal to hire someone like that because, we all can see where the arc of history is going, right? And sort of that's, that world, the world of George W. Bush, the world of conservative Christianity is being left in the rear view mirror, which is not, I would say, the mentality that most liberals have today. And what's interesting is if you think about the last 10 years, this period of increasing weirdness, as I described it at the outset, conservative Christianity in its sort of 2004 era form has not actually made a comeback. America has continued to become less traditionally Christian. Churches have continued to shrink. Church-going has continued to decline. Christian identification has continued to decline. There are various attempts, I think, by liberal observers who are unhappy with trends in American society to sort of revive the anxieties that liberals felt 20 years ago and to say, well, the real threat is Christian nationalism. But I don't think that is actually, the world has not gotten weirder over the last 10 years through the revival of conservative forms of Christianity. What has made the world weirder in the last 10 years is a combination of sort of the working out of technological changes, the internet and social media and so on, whose full implications were just not understood for the first 10 or 15 years of the internet as a mass phenomenon. I think the transition from the laptop or the desktop to the iPhone, and the transition from sort of the old internet to the world of social media, both of which sort of take hold fully in Obama's first term, have changed Western culture in pretty powerful and important ways and made them weirder, I think, in ways that are pretty obvious if you spend a lot of time on the internet. I think you obviously have a return of ideology on the right and on the left, populism and wokeness, right, that have sort of convinced people, I think left people somewhat overly convinced that we have somehow swung back all the way to the combat of the 1930s. I don't think we've swung back that far at all, but you do have sort of a scale of ideological conflict in the world that you didn't have 10 years ago. There's been a return of great power conflict, a return of cross-border aggression, a sort of 9/11 style event in Israel on October 7th, and then we had a plague, right? A once, hopefully, knock wood, right? A once in a century plague. So all of that has sort of made the world weirder in ways that I would say are sort of let's call them sort of the secular forms of weirdness, right? It's like, okay, we have issues of ideological extremism and conflict. We have issues related to terrorism. We have the specter of climate change. We have Russia invading Ukraine. We have, all of these are sort of forms of instability, but forms of instability that also, to some extent still fit within the paradigm of like Yale University normalcy, right? Like you can convene a seminar on populism and nationalism. Convening a seminar on wokeness would be a little more fraught, but but certainly those debates are present on the Yale University campus, right? In some form, you can, obviously you can have endless arguments about COVID and pandemic policy and so on, but then there's another current that's sort of woven into all of that, right? Which is the extent to which you've had sort of a thinning of the membrane between that sort of normal world and the world of kind of, maybe you'd say sort of either supernaturalism or things that seem a little bit like supernaturalism if you think about them for a long time, right? So, for one thing, the sort of cutting edge of technology, or at least the alleged cutting edge of technology right now in the United States, is the attempts of a bunch of very smart people in Northern California to summon up demigods and minor demons inside the carapace of, artificial intelligence, right? That, and again, like I'm throwing in some, supernatural language here to sort of be provocative, but in fact, if you sit around and sort of talk to people involved in that kind of work, read about that kind of work, it's first of all, there's sort of a basic reality that a number of very important people involved in that work, while they do not believe in literal demigods and demons, do in fact believe that they are bringing something that is potentially godlike into the world. Many of them believe that human beings being superseded by these new godlike intelligence is inevitable. Some subset of these people believe that it is desirable. These people are extremely rich and successful and powerful and influential. This is not sort of, the Heaven's Gate cult or something hanging out on a compound. Like, again, this is sort of the cutting edge of technology. And people are like, we're, to put it in Jewish terms, we're building a golem, right? I mean, that's what we're doing here. We're hoping that it works out for the best, hoping that the golem cures cancer for us. The downside might be that it wipes out the whole human race. Like, we're balancing the scales here, right? Like that's a conversation that we're having. That's a weird conversation. It's a weird conversation if you think it's all ultimately a fraud and is not going to achieve the kind of singularitarian liftoff that people think it is. It's weird even if it's not. If it is going to achieve that kind of liftoff, it's even weirder. It's a weird moment, right? And you do have, I would say, within that culture, you do have people who I think about this, whether they acknowledge it or not, in frankly supernatural terms. I don't want to impute too much supernaturalism to the AI enterprise, but I think there's more of it there than you would expect, or at least, when you read about some of these, polycule-based Silicon Valley social scenes, right? People will use the language of demonology sort of ironically and winkingly and so on. That even that is pretty weird, right? So you have that going on. You have in the in the decline of Christianity, in the weakening of traditional religious institutions, not the sort of burst of universal scientific rationalism that the new atheists confidently anticipated. Instead, you really do have a return of witchcraft, right? Like if you go to the Barnes & Noble in North Haven, where I spent a lot of time when I was a cool teenager, as one does, you go to the religion and spirituality section of Barnes & Noble, and 10 years ago you would go and there would be a big section of Bibles, some Christianity, little Judaica, a bunch of sort of spiritual self-help, Joel Osteen kind of books, and then a shelf of tarot cards and magic and the women who run with the wolves, the stuff I remember well from my youth. And what you notice over the last 10 years is the women who run with the wolves shelves have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and now you go into Barnes & Noble and it's like one third of the religion books that they're selling are books about magic, the occult, tarot cards, and related matters. Now, I don't want to claim that 1/3 of American religion is now sort of, post-Christian, pagan, occult spirituality. I don't think the North Haven Barnes & Noble perfectly maps onto the spiritual landscape of America, but I do think the spiritual landscape of America is moving in a much more magical direction. At the very least, you have a return to where we were in the 1970s in terms of interest in the paranormal, the occult, psychic phenomena, and again, sort of frank, straightforward magic. And I think there's a big question about like where sort of ironic magic bleeds into actual belief, right? Like the way people talk about their horoscopes and astrology and so on certainly exists in a kind of blurred space between ironic and sincere. But there's clearly been a big movement just over the last 20 years. When I was a kid, if you met someone at a party at Harvard in the year of our Lord 2000 and you introduced yourself and told them that you were a Scorpio, they would look at you like you'd farted, right? And that's obviously now everyone, not everyone, but it's much more commonplace. And so at the very least, there's sort of a pendulum swing back to 1970s America there. Connected to that, you have sort of the rise or / return of hallucinogenic and psychedelic experience as a meaningful constitutive part of American culture. Again, how far this goes, I think, is an open question, but it's one of the big cultural stories of the last 10 or 15 years, that it's become completely normal to treat sort of psychedelic self-care as either a part of your mental health portfolio or a part of your sort of spiritual quest, or both. And then this is was never an area of my own interest to any degree until 5 or 6 years ago. But, there are many people highly positioned in the United States government who are convinced that unidentified flying objects / unidentified aerial phenomena, whatever we're supposed to call them, are an actual matter of serious national security concern. Which again brings us back in certain ways to prior periods of UFO fascination, but my understanding of how this is treated by people in the Pentagon and in sort of the institutions of American government is that we've gone a bit beyond the past eras, and that, there may not actually be extraterrestrial visitors, but there is a significant faction in the United States government that takes this possibility, or some even weirder possibilities, which we can get into in the Q&A, seriously, and that's pretty weird, right? And again, I mentioned the plague that we just had as a kind of, normal, not abnormal, but sort of legible kind of phenomenon. And it is a legible kind of phenomenon. The Yale School of Public Health can, sort of react to it and so on. But, there is a good chance that millions and millions of people were killed by a disease that was invented in a laboratory funded by American government dollars, right? And, what you do with that possibility is sort of an open question, but it's the kind of thing that, if you had described it in the old sort of less weird world, would have seemed itself pretty weird and sort of in the territory of sort of conspiracy theories that you wouldn't have sort of imagined seriously entertaining as a possibility. So I don't know. I could go on, but I think that gives you sort of a sketch of like some of the things I'm thinking about that have, some of the ways in which our world is becoming meaningfully weirder in ways that bleed into even the kind of secular confidence and sort of materialist certainty of a place like Yale. And I do think it's an open question just how far this goes. I think if you look back to, to the history of sort of weirdness in American life, you tend to have sort of waves of religious / supernatural / paranormal enthusiasm that crest and sort of die away and give way to periods of sort of secular confidence again. I think that's clearly what happened to a lot of a lot of the weird new age energy of the 1970s gave way to a sort of more materialist and worldly and secular culture in the decades thereafter. I think in certain ways the kind of weird Pentecostalist experiences that I had as a kid were kind of the withdrawing roar of 1970s weirdness, right? Like a lot of that sort of vineyard type charismatic Christianity comes out of sort of the Christian analog to the hippies and sort of 60s culture, right? So I was sort of caught in the last moment of one wave of weirdness, and then 20 years went by, and now we're in another wave of weirdness, right? So I think you could tell a story where you'd expect the pendulum to swing back soon, that this has been a weird 10 or 15 years, but that things are going to normalize, the world is going to restabilize, and a few key UFO sightings will be debunked, and the people who believe in it at the Pentagon will become too embarrassed to talk to reporters about it again, right? And there'll be a bunch of studies showing that like psychedelics aren't actually all that great, and people will stop being so excited about them, right? I can totally tell that kind of story. But I do think it's important to keep an open mind and recognize that in fact the world could in fact continue to get weirder for some substantial period ahead of us. I'll end here, but my distinguished Yale colleague, Carlos Ayer, wrote a book that just came out called They Flew. And, he's a distinguished historian of sort of, Catholicism and the Reformation era. And this book is about flying in 16th and 17th century Europe. A lot of Catholic saints, mystics, some accused witches and devil worshippers, but basically like mass reports of not like one guy said he saw someone fly, but like 100 people all agreed that, yeah, totally, Saint so-and-so, he would just, every few weeks he would levitate, and that was just like, that was sort of part of it. And the Ayer book, which I highly recommend, is great reading because Ayer is, a practiced, he's a man of the modern intelligentsia, right? The book is written in this very, very careful style where it's like, this is all sort of sociological analysis, and it's a fascinating cultural phenomenon, and, obviously you don't have to really think they flew to be really interested in this, but, if you read it carefully, he clearly thinks they just flew, right? Like 100%. There was a lot of flying in 16th and 17th century Europe, and to you I would say, you don't have to believe that the people actually flew, but 16th and 17th century Europe was, it was the cutting edge, right? It was the age of early scientific exploration, the printing press, everything else. It was not a period of sort of barbarous superstition. It was in its own way quite modern, and yet not for, a period of 15 or 20 years, but for a period of many decades, this phenomenon of flying, which again, you totally don't have to believe in, was nonetheless like a really, influential and important feature of European religious culture and a source of conflict and argument and paranoia and persecution and all kinds of things. And I don't think we're yet at that point where any of the sort of weird quasi-supernatural things that are sort of probing at our secular normalcy have gotten to the point where future historians are going to look back and say, oh yeah, the ayahuasca demons played a crucial role in American politics in the 2040s. I'm just saying, you should not completely rule that kind of much, much weirder future out. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Question, Rachel.
Thank you so much for the talk. So I was really intrigued by your point about the shifting types of books on Barnes & Noble's shelves over the years. And when I go into the religion and spirituality section, in addition to noticing all the literature on astrology, and psychedelics, I also notice a lot of books on self-help and therapy. And it's interesting to observe this kind of rise and an interest in mental health over the past couple of decades or so as well, whereby the sentiments espoused by therapists to their clients, like it's okay to be anxious, you should be comfortable in your own skin, seem to kind of be grounded in really theological sentiments about being worthy because you're made in the image of God, but they kind of are like missing the point. And so therapy, it seems to be kind of like a secular alternative to a lot of religious institutions. It's interesting to observe that, Yale students frequently complain about lack of access to psychologists on campus. And so I'm just wondering whether you think that the increase in an interest in therapy specifically and this interest in mental health is going to be part of the pendulum swing back to more traditional religious institutions and the use of going to church as a method of calming oneself down, or whether they're going to exist in tandem together in the future.
Yeah, so first I would say, I graduated from college in 2002 and lived in Washington, D.C. for a long time, and then lived in a different part of Connecticut and came back to New Haven probably in like 2017 or 2018, and through Patrick and some other people, became involved in doing some stuff at Yale. And everybody said, and I observed this myself, that the biggest single change in undergraduate life and culture was not, politics, not wokeness, not, anything sort of ideological. It was personal unhappiness, mental health problems, people being, sort of essentially a kind of either a mental health crisis or a sort of mentality of a mental health crisis, which is sort of, is evident, I think, in data as well as sort of impressions. I'm not sure if it was Yale or Harvard that I saw a chart just the other day of like the percentage of students reporting, having sought psychological counseling, being depressed, these kind of things. These things are all way, way up, right? So clearly, that's one of the core shifts of the last generation. I think it's a little bit hard to tell. There's a fair amount of evidence that the shift is, that there's just a fundamental shift in like people are just unhappier, right? Young people are just unhappier, independently of how you handle that, right? Whether you sort of believe in therapeutic models of treatment or not. There's just sort of a basic increase. Again, I think corresponding pretty clearly to changes in technology and social life. There's sort of a baseline of increased unhappiness. And then as to what sort of therapy culture is doing in there, I'm not completely sure, right? Like there's a sense in which therapy sort of overtook Christianity as like a dominant American mode of thought like 50 or 60 years ago, right? Like Philip Rieff wrote The Triumph of the Therapeutic, I don't know when that was, like early 60s, right? Basically arguing that there was this shift, within religion itself, right? That religion was moving from being focused on, the next life, preparation for the next life, to a kind of to sort of offering itself as a mode of reconciling people to their everyday lives in this world, to essentially religion as therapy, therapy as therapy. And, the Barnes & Noble self-help stuff, like, that stuff was all there 10 or 15 years ago, right? But I think 10 or 15 years ago, it was more likely to be sort of still subsumed a bit into sort of, maybe still packaged a bit more in religious packaging, right? So it was like, yeah, a lot of the leading preachers of, 10 or 15 years ago, figures like Joel Osteen, figures like Oprah Winfrey, right, if you want to include her, figures like Deepak Chopra and so on, were presenting, they were presenting a kind of like, I don't know, a sort of Christian or Christian-ish framework around a therapeutic message, right? It was like, we're delivering therapy, but we're saying it's like, having some kind of connection to God, right? And it seems like, at least in sort of elite spaces in the last 10 or 15 years, like that, maybe it's that optimism has gone away, right? Like Oprah's a very optimistic figure, fundamentally, right? It was like, you're gonna do therapy, and it's gonna, you're gonna do self-help, and it's gonna make you happier, and it's gonna, whatever God may be, it's gonna reconcile you with God. And I do feel like I don't know, my sense of the contemporary scene is that it's more like, yeah, therapy is gonna help you reckon with the fact that the world is terrible, and climate change is gonna kill us all, and you probably shouldn't have kids. And therapy is just a way of reconciling yourself to the darkness of life in the Anthropocene under the shadow of Trumpian fascism. And yeah, like that, I don't know, there's sort of, yeah, it's sort of, the therapeutic mentality is consistent, but somehow the mentality has gotten darker, I'd say, as people have gotten unhappier. Right, which leads me as a skeptic of all things therapeutic to wonder if the therapy itself might be not making, part of what's making people unhappier, that there's this sort of symbiotic relationship where you're unhappy and then, you go to therapy and it sort of vindicates you in your own unhappiness. It's like, yeah, it really is that bad. I'm sorry, you'll die alone, right? But we have some drugs for you to take. I don't know, that's sort of one possible reading. But there's also a sense, to connect this back to like the sort of weird supernaturalism stuff a little bit, right? Like, I think there's a sense in which people are, 20 years ago there was this sense of like, okay, it's a kind of harmonious universe, right? And maybe it's a harmonious universe because you are a sort of liberal-leaning Christian who believes in some kind of providence and some kind of arc of history. Maybe it's a universe. I know you had Steven Pinker here recently. Like, Steven Pinker, it's like, yeah, there's no God, but look at the data. Things are getting better, right? You can see it in the data, right? That was a powerful idea, and I think as pessimism has come in, right, kind of pessimism about material circumstances, pessimism about the cosmos, people really are sort of looking for more lowercase g gods than they have been at any point in my lifetime. Like, I do think this is sort of a core spiritual development of the last 5 or 10 years, this sense that like we don't think the God, the big guy, is there or can help us, but we feel sort of incompetent on our own. We don't believe in Pinker's ascending march of material progress. So we're like, okay, maybe there's AI is going to help us, right? Psychedelics are going to help us. The beings that you meet on your journey, on your psychedelic journey, are going to help us. And that is kind of a return of a more, paganish religious sensibility. And I don't know, I don't know what role exactly the therapist as a figure plays in that dynamic. But I do think there's a desire for sort of intermediate figures to sort of provide some kind of direct practical help in a landscape where people don't trust the universe and don't trust themselves. That was a very long answer, sorry.
You can just go down.
Thank you. One thing I guess I was surprised that you didn't address was the sort of resurgence of religious traditionalism in many quarters. We see, I think actually one of the places you see it in particular is like at the university. I don't know, you see like a lot of religious conversions, and then they tend to be like, the students are like, no, I don't want the weak stuff, I want like the really hard stuff, you know.
The hair shirts.
Yeah. You want, like, you have these, you know, students like Stanford and Harvard that like want to bring in like Louis the 20th, or like bring back the Holy Roman Emperor.
Yeah.
And in a weird way, the college campuses is where like these very traditional religious people will like then interact with the New Age folks. One of my friends who goes to Berkeley, she told me a story. She's like a very traditional Latin Mass Catholic. She had her necklace with her saint medals on it, and she walked into one of these like cafes in Berkeley, and one of these New Age girls came up to her and was like, "I love your charms." She's like, "No, these are not charms. These are like saint medals." But I'm curious, what do you think's going on with this sort of resurgence in traditionalism, and do you think it's going to sort of continue, or it'll, you know, sort of peter out, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I should have and could have mentioned that. I think that there, to some degree, it's a little hard for me to tell sort of how much of it is sort of more people are into religious traditionalism as opposed to how much it is like the world is weirder, so people who are traditionalist feel more like the world could go their way, right? So like when I was in college a long time ago, right, there were religious traditionalists, there were Latin Mass Catholics, there were people who wanted to bring back the Stuarts. I assure you, there have all, you know, hang out in any right-wing crowd for long enough, and you'll meet someone who wants to restore just about every defunct European dynasty, right? Like that I think. So there may be more people who feel that way and identify that way. I do think sort of what you might call like the normie forms of both religion and politics feel kind of stale and defunct to a lot of people. So there probably are more people identifying, if you will, that way. But I think there also is just also a sense of like greater possibility. Like I have a friend from college, a guy named Gladden Papin, who went to Harvard with me many years ago. He was a couple years below me. He was like a deputy editor for the conservative paper. And he was a guy who seemed like he was, born 50 years old, right? And was a like full tilt, I don't know who he wanted to restore, but he wanted to restore somebody, right? And it was like that was sort of a thing you talked about over drinks that had no relevance to, politics when George W. Bush and Al Gore were running against each other for the presidency. But now Gladden Papin works for the government of Hungary, right? Like I mean, we're not like in touch all the time, but he has some kind of portfolio for the government of Hungary. Now, is the government of Hungary itself real or a LARP? This is itself an open question, right? But that alone, I think, is sort of an indicator of, just the extent to which this weirdness has enabled people who have weird ideas to feel like their weird ideas are part of the world, like are part of political reality, right? In a way that they weren't. Like were there Catholic integralists in 1997? Of course there were Catholic integralists. Was anybody writing about the Catholic integralists or arguing with the Catholic integralists? No, it was not. These were, seen as sort of incredibly arcane questions that could not possibly have any bearing on sort of the normal, right? And the normal, the power of the normal in just about every sphere, I think, has just diminished, encouraging people who want to be serious about things to be, as you say, more hardcore, and also encouraging the people who would have been hardcore no matter what to, feel like they can have a role in influencing the world, again, in a way that, the assumption in the year 2000 was that, you argued about that stuff late at night, and then you forgot about it, and it didn't matter for like real world politics, and that's not quite the case anymore.
Hello, Ross. In talking about America's religions, I couldn't help but think about how a lot of America's more modern movements have resulted in expansions to Christianity. We have very eclectic Christianity in America. Imagine if you were, perhaps a science fiction writer looking at how different parts of Christianity might absorb parts of these new exoteric religions that you're describing. For example, maybe Episcopalianism has embraced a bit of wokeness as a new religion. Would you care to opine on that?
Sure. I mean, yeah, the pattern for most of American history was that you would have these sort of, let's call them weird periods, right, to just sort of stick with my terminology. These periods of sort of supernaturalist ferment, and usually they would cash out in either sort of some kind of growth for Christian churches that sort of successfully co-opted them or absorbed them, or the founding of new institutions, new religious, sort of not just movements, but actual sort of structures, right? With, the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints being a prime example, Christian Science, which was for a long time a sort of important institutional force in American religion in the Northeast especially. And so that was sort of the normal pattern, right? You have ferment, you have startup institutions, and you have established churches that sort of absorb some of the ferment. And that pattern sort of stopped holding, really, I think, in the 1960s. Like, that was sort of the first, you could call the 60s and 70s the first major religious awakening in American history where Christianity came out of the awakening somewhat weaker than it went in. And I think maybe we will look back on this period as sort of a similar phase, right, where you have sort of political zeal, especially on the left, that, calling it a great awakening is sort of useful, right, as to contrast it with the Great Awakenings, right, that it's sort of a kind of post-Protestant moral crusade. And then you have a lot of forms of spirituality that just seem quite disconnected from even sort of heretical or eccentric forms of Christianity. So you can tell a story where that just continues, right? And you have, the traditionalists of various Christian denominations and, in Judaism and maybe to some extent Islam grow, but they're growing from a very small base, right? So you have a future where you have a sort of zealous but kind of shrunken forms of Western monotheism in a landscape that at sort of the mass level is just becoming more and more post-Christian, right? So the Catholics who remain are going to the Latin Mass, but there just aren't the kind of numbers and influence for Catholicism that it enjoyed in 1957. But you could also imagine a future where, you have sort of adaptation and absorption, right? That like certain forms, let's say certain forms of sort of New Age self-help oriented religion are successfully absorbed by the most successful form of Christianity in America today, which is non-denominational Protestantism, right? Everybody's in decline except non-denominational Protestantism. And it may be that that's because non-denominational Protestantism is just itself sort of dissolving into kind of feel-good New Age spirituality, but maybe there's enough Christian dynamism there that it can sort of absorb some of the New Age energy, the therapeutic energy, rather than the other way around. And maybe there's enough dynamism left in traditional Catholicism, right, that there is a future where, the New Age waitress who likes the charms, right, this was a pattern often in 19th century Europe, right? You had people who went all the way through the occult and ended up back in Roman Catholicism, right? Like, who's the guy in Welbeck's novel? The guy who wrote Là-bas. The French decadents were like, today I'm a Satanist, but tomorrow I'm going to be back in the Roman Church, right? And at a certain point, like that, if you push far enough through the occult, that's become semi-inevitable. It's like, are you really going to stick with Satan forever? I mean, You might, but it's unadvisable. Depends on the fixity of the will after death. But, sorry. The one laugh for the Thomist jokes. But yeah, so I think those are sort of two ways of thinking about it, right? That you could imagine sort of continued de-Christianization with sort of pockets of intense, successful Christian institution building that are just nowhere near large enough to influence the culture as a whole, or you can imagine some kind of successful reabsorption of post-Christian spiritual energy into, again, yeah, it seems to me like if you were betting on forms of Christianity in America right now, for all its problems, you'd bet on the Roman Church on the one hand and the non-denominational Protestants on the other hand. It's harder to bet on an Episcopalian or United Methodist comeback. It seems to me like we are the era of sort of denominational Protestantism, of like, okay, you live in a town and there are 6 denominations and they're all basically equal and sort of in competition with each other. That seems to be over. Maybe the Southern Baptist Convention sort of endures as a kind of locus, but I wouldn't be long denominational Protestantism right now.
I think we had a question from Hayes, then we should get some from the other side of the table as well.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was really fascinating. I had a question. I'm from an East Asian background, and how normally we try to explain or narrativize like the reason why there's like a rise in supernaturalism is we normally talk about the economy, like, oh, there was a recession, that's why there's like a rise in like cults in Japan, that's why there was like that huge terror attack in like the Tokyo subway, or even like in like the Korean case, oh, IMF, oh, like there's a rise in like cults, all that stuff. So I was wondering like how much of like, so like in the American case, like for example in 2008, was there any kind of like correlation between like this like rise in supernaturalism, or normally is it just like explained differently, I guess, not through the economic lens?
I mean, I'm not like a sort of historian or sociologist of religion, so take this with a grain of salt. But I would say the modern American pattern has not at all followed sort of arcs of economic rise and fall. Like nobody thinks of 1930s America as sort of like a zone of revivalism. To the extent that there's sort of a religious revival in America, it starts in a big way after World War II with the post-World War II boom. That's sort of, so you get sort of two things in the middle of the 20th century. You get a revival of denominational Protestantism, right? Like the sort of like people are like, oh, I was raised Lutheran, I drifted away, but it's the baby boom. I'm moving to the suburbs. I'm going to join, a church. Like that's the American way. And then 10 or 15 years after that, you get the more sort of, the weirder, more supernaturalist New Age awakening of the 1960s and 70s, and that is happening at a peak of American prosperity. There's plenty of social unrest and social turbulence in that era, but there's no sort of pattern of an economic crash sets off a sort of a return to religion. And I think after 2008, something similar is the case, right? Like the immediate aftermath of the Great Recession was in many ways, it sort of, to the extent that it led to, ferment, it was almost all sort of secular political. Like the Tea Party was much more secular than George W. Bush's Republican Party, even though it was often some of the same people, like the issue set, the interests, like what people were concerned about. And similarly on the left, Occupy Wall Street was, a sort of, I would say Occupy Wall Street was much more secular than Barack Obama's 2008 campaign, right? Obama was still very much sort of doing outreach to religious voters, and it's after the crash that you get sort of a revival of like socialism, sort of secular socialism on the left. And then things don't, the kind of weirdness I'm describing, the return of magic, if you will, I think doesn't really start until, Obama's second term. And there's sort of a slow economic recovery, there's economic disappointment, you could say there's some economic factors, but it's not a reaction to like dispossession and collapse. It's more a sort of sense of like, maybe it comes out of like anomie and ennui, amid prosperity to some extent. You could make that argument. But yeah, I don't think that's been the pattern. Which is not to say that you can't get like specific cases of like you have a crash and some religious body benefits or some cult benefits from it. But generally, yeah, the high water marks for different kinds of religious energy in America have not corresponded always to, yeah, sort of crashes and shocks and disappointments, and it's often seemed to run a little bit the other way.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Does anyone?
I'll try and give short answers. I'm sorry.
Well, why don't we do two at the same time? That way. Yeah, both of you. Shoulders might pass me. You just ask a question and pass to Harrison. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed your talk on the weirdness and supernaturalness. So I have a question for you about yourself. Do you ever see yourself becoming America's Gabriel Garcia Marquez? And do you think you could find some of the answer you're searching for in fiction writing?
So every political journalist, as a friend of mine once said, is either a failed politician or a failed novelist. And I am much more in the failed novelist camp, although my interests have been, I never wrote a magical realist novel. I would never see myself as sort of a Marquez figure. The unpublished novel that I have is a like George R.R. Martin style fantasy novel. It's much more embarrassing, I'm afraid. I mean, I have a couple other unfinished, like realistic, serious great American novel type things, but the only one I ever finished is a fantasy novel. But yeah, I mean, I think there is obviously sort of part of me that thinks that, I'm a big believer in the idea that American culture as a whole is sort of sterile and decadent and stuck, and in a way this sort of like magic and weirdness and so on is the most interesting thing in a landscape that otherwise is not that interesting and not that dynamic. So when I'm trying to be sort of an optimist about American culture, I do sort of think like maybe the sort of, the interest in tarot cards and UFOs and so on could be part of some kind of ferment in which great movies and great novels could once again be part of things again. I would, though, say that, like, I do want to be sort of a slight literalist about some of these things. Like, in the case of, for instance, UFOs, right? Like, I have absolutely no, sort of certain conviction about what is going on with, like, the weird things Navy pilots see in the sky. But I would like to know what is actually going on with the weird things that the Navy pilots see in the sky. And if all of this sort of ends up in a like, we make another Close Encounters of the Third Kind and we get the next X-Files, but like the question of like why all these people in the government became convinced we, were in contact with aliens or demons, that question just sort of goes away. I would be very dissatisfied. I actually, there's a bunch of these weird questions where I'm not in it for the art. I would like some answers. So.
I guess I was wondering how you think about weirdness in the global context. Is this like is this a American phenomenon? Is this only something that makes sense to talk about in reference to some kind of like American normal culture? How do you see it outside the boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure how to think about it in global context, in part because I just feel like I have a better handle on trends in the United States than I do on, whatever is happening in the People's Republic of China, for instance, right? Like what exactly is happening elsewhere. I think, though, that, to some extent, one, America has always been religiously weird. Like this is a constituent feature of our national identity, right? And like if you compare, I think there is a contrast between secularism in America and secularism in Europe, for instance, just mean totally different things. Secularism in Europe is like it's like I'm secular, but I used to be Lutheran, and like my identity is still formed by residual Lutheranism or residual Catholicism, or Emmanuel Todd, the French intellectual is always talking about zombie Catholicism as like sort of the still a presiding force in France. Or you're like anti-clerical, right? You're like, my identity is opposition to the dominant religious culture of my society. And America just isn't quite like that. Like we, there's just too much ferment, there's too much weirdness, there are too many startup religions to sort of fall into that kind of pattern. You get, in the South, Southern Protestantism still exerts some version of that, like where people who aren't practicing Methodist or Baptist are still sort of defined to some extent by that culture. Catholicism has some influence like that, but I just don't think it's at all quite like it is in Europe. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm generally I think the weird thing we didn't talk about tonight, because it's, I don't think it fits necessarily into my sort of supernaturalist framework, right? Is the other thing that's changed in the last 5 or 10 years is that the birth dearth in the world has accelerated, right? Population decline has gone from being the sort of thing that like only conservative cranks like me worry about to being a sort of generally understood crisis for the entire developed world, worst in East Asia, serious in Europe, and an issue in the United States. And again, I don't know how long that acceleration will go on. Maybe birth rates will stabilize and so on. But right now, it seems like we're headed for a future where, if you're looking for dynamism in general over the next 50 years, you're probably going to find it in America more than almost anywhere else in the world. And so the fact that we are sort of a locus for weird spiritual and religious dynamism right now, it might end up being really influential. Like I think, to be interested in America in an odd way right now is to be interested in the future of humanity, almost in a more profound way than when we were technically more powerful 25 or 30 years ago. Like our overt hard power is declining. China might beat us in a war in the next 5 or 10 years. I'm quite worried about that. But like over a 25 to 50 year time horizon, I think if, the world in 2075, like America is going to be more important than it is now. And so religiously, the weird shit that we're up to is maybe more influential globally than one, would have necessarily expected even 10 or 20 years ago.
Want to say a final word?
Yeah, I'd actually like to ask you a question. Reading between the lines, please correct me if I'm wrong, Ross. My sense is that you're somewhat frustrated. Please tell me if I am wrong. And the frustration, and maybe I'm reading this in a mirror sense, something that I'm frustrated with. So my reading of your talk is that you are a religious person. You have certain convictions. You grew up with a mom who, took you to these places. You were brought up in a house of faith, but you also went to Harvard and got a liberal arts education. To some extent, you lean back to the comfort and the depth of a religious household and religious history, religious conviction, and it gives you a certain sense of strength. You look at America, and you say America has somewhat lost that, and therefore we're moving into all these kind of odd, different new religions, whether they be secularism or demonology or therapy, psychedelics, etc. And you're trying to navigate, how do you bring people that are not necessarily of religious persuasion back to religion if they don't buy it? Like, so maybe we grew up with it, and so we believe in it. It makes sense to us. We're not going to convince the whole world to go in that direction. There's too much on TikTok and in the internet and Twitter to bring people back. But they don't quite have the answer, and they're learning slowly, or maybe quickly now, that they don't have the answer. But we need to do something about it, because this nihilism and decadence is at such epic proportions that it's going to somewhat destroy the fabric of the country. Am I right to say that that is something you're struggling with, or am I wrong and you believe you have the answer? That's the way I read this.
I don't think I have the answer.
And that's not my question, but that's the lead into my question.
Okay. I mean, yes, I obviously think like, I think that many of the sort of sociological trends I'm describing are pulling the country further apart, and that religion, well, when the idea of sort of being spiritual but not religious, I think that's very bad. I think it's better to be religious but not spiritual. Best to be both, but if you had to choose one, right? And religious institutions are good for society. Their decline is bad for society. Obviously, I think, Roman Catholicism is true and demonology is incredibly dangerous, right? So I have some, a more demon-haunted Barnes & Noble book section seems like a bad thing to me. But I guess I also have to balance that with a sense of like, well, what as someone who is a practicing Catholic and a serious religious believer, like, should I find this world more frustrating than the world of 10 or 15 years ago of sort of like peak, atheist smugness, right? Like, I feel like the age of atheist smugness has passed. It's gone, right?
It failed.
It failed, right? And I mean, in sort of obvious ways. And I guess I see, I do have the frustration you described, but it is balanced with a sense of sort of, there are a lot of interesting possibilities in a weird landscape, right? In a weirder landscape, than in a landscape of, the clash of sort of boring ideas. There's sort of more scenario. I mean, I have a deep frustration with a certain kind of like, there's a certain kind of attitude towards religion. There's a certain kind of atheism that I find sort of intellectually embarrassing and ridiculous. Like that as I have gotten older, I have become both slightly less dogmatic in my own Catholicism and much more dogmatic in my supernaturalism. Like, I think atheism is just rubbish, like obviously rubbish. And to the extent that like Yale University, Yale Law School is filled with,
And the New York Times.
lovely, I'm not commenting on the New York Times on the record or off, but
I am.
but
I am.
Yale Law School, right, is filled with, lovely, highly intelligent people who I think have just rubbish ideas about metaphysics, the nature of the cosmos, and the human place in the world, or self-contradictory ideas, right? And that is frustrating. But if that, to the extent that like that is a frustration, I feel like the ground is collapsing under those people's feet much faster than it's collapsing under my own feet.
Yeah.
And so, I mean,
Each for their own, to some extent.
to some extent, and like I mean, to be a Christian is to be a providentialist, right? So like, it's all going to work out in the end.
Right. So I just want to suggest, I share the sentiment of the frustration, and which is why I really appreciated what you had to say, what you said tonight. You're identifying it, you're bringing it to light, and you're not going all the way to the end and saying, look, the answer is come to the church. And you didn't say that tonight because you're speaking to a crowd of Yale students as a writer. You're not a member of
With our elder brothers in faith.
Yeah, that's okay. But that's okay. I would tell people to come to the synagogue. So, but that we can have another conversation. But I
That's a Friday night conversation.
yeah, that's exactly.
I think.
But here's what I do want to say. Here's what I do want to say. For those of us in the room that do have strong religious convictions and are active in our religious communities, that is the premise and the foundation on which we live our lives. Everything else comes after that. And there are many of us here tonight, many of us in the world around us, even in the liberal arts, higher education institutions. Then there's the majority which are not. And for those of us inside the religious community, we look out and we say, yeah, but the world has so much pain, so much suffering. Everybody's in therapy, everybody's in meds, including religious people, but much more so in the secular, nihilistic world. And so what's the answer? One answer is to promote our religions, proselytize religions or not. Another is to find bridges and to find conduits and conversations. Both of those tasks are Herculean. I want to suggest something a little bit novel. And maybe something, I don't want to say compromising, but something that may be the small g you talked about. What is the new small g that can work for the atheist, for the devout atheist, who's not going to enter the church or the synagogue or the mosque, but is suffering and looking for something. And I want to propose it, and I propose it to the table here because this is, in some ways, this is my synagogue. Like, my friends ask me, do you have a synagogue? Are you you're a rabbi, do you have a pulpit? I say, no, I don't have a pulpit. I sit around the table a couple times a week with a bunch of people, and we have these conversations. My suggestion to think about tonight is that the core of the problem is the loneliness today in the world. And the technology, in an ironic way, has enhanced the loneliness. Right? Everybody's smiling on Facebook, and then when you see them live, they're not so smiling. Everybody's projecting, and everyone is presenting, and we live in a world where the instant world, the world of impressions, etc. There's a very, very deep loneliness, somewhat fostered by that technology. And for me, perhaps, I would say, coming from a religion that doesn't proselytize, Jews don't believe the answer is to make everybody Jewish. So maybe this is the way I'm forced, almost compelled to think about it, but maybe even for Christians, the answer is community. The answer to America's mental crisis is to foster community, to foster dialogue, to foster conversation, to, irrespective of religion, come to terms with the oneness of humanity and the ability for all of us to sit down in person regularly and talk to each other and realize how similar we actually are and how we actually deal with so many of the same things. And that itself, that experience itself, is a form of spirituality. Because what it does is it allows us to open up to each other as human beings and to find something that we actually share, which is the essence of who we are, regardless of which religion we come from. And that the therapeutic and the sort of uplifting flying that we talk about is in the experience itself of community. And if we thought more about honest, real community of getting together, I think there's something about healing America. And that's a suggestion I say to you as somebody who has such a big audience, and I think you can't promote the Catholic doctrine on the page of the New York Times or maybe even at a class at Yale Law School. And if you can, I have this conversation with Brett Stevens a lot too, about other things. There's a certain limit where there's a boss and there's an editorial board and there's a faculty, there's an administration. You can do it at home, you can maybe do it here, you can do it in certain places. And maybe that's not the place for it. I think the one thing we can talk about in this country more, as religious people or non-religious people, that I think no one can argue with, is the need for us to get together and actually connect with each other in a real way, talking to each other, looking each other in the eyes, and realizing how maybe on Sunday I go to this church and on Saturday I go to that synagogue, and maybe I celebrate Pesach and and somebody puts up a Christmas tree, and that's great and that's wonderful and that's the diversity of a religious community. But we all are dealing with children, health, career, life, wellness, survival, resumes, relationships that are irrespective of religion. And if we just spent more time talking to each other, I go back to AA as a fantastic model of having saved so many people's lives in a specific place, but the model of just getting people to a room and talking, and other institutes like that, the salons of the, 70s and 80s that ran in America for a long time and then died. And I think if we just had more dialogue, in-person conversations, I think that may be something that the small g could possibly. So that's my suggestion. I don't know if you want to comment on it or not. I wanted to share it with you.
Well, I feel bad not leaving you the last word. It was so eloquent. But before I exit, on a practical level, I endorse everything you just said, especially. I think the figuring out how to both escape from but also master the technologies that are currently mastering us is one of the great challenges, one of the great human challenges. The next 10 years, maybe the next 100 years, we didn't get the Dune question, but the Butlerian jihad may yet need to be waged against machines. But I agree, but I don't completely agree. I do think, as I said, I don't exactly proselytize for Roman Catholicism in the pages of the Times. I don't exactly proselytize for Roman Catholicism in the class I'm co-teaching at at Yale. But I don't really think it works without God in the end, you know. I think we have friends who just started going to a Unitarian church, and my kids, you know, asked me like, you know, well, what do you think about this? And, you know, I was like, well, you know, I mean, I think some obvious limitations, right, to Unitarian theology, but I was like, it is almost infinitely better than what they were doing before. And yeah, the older I get, the more I feel like the gap between Unitarianism and Catholicism seems a little smaller to me, and the gap between both of them and non-belief seems really large. And so, I don't know, I'd still put in for the capital G God as an essential feature, because, you know, we're all gonna die.
I'm really glad that the rabbi was being a little bit liberally progressive, and the writer was.
I brought it back.
I'm ready to settle for the small G. You want the big G? That's great.
big
Great
G.
way to end the night.
All right, thank you, guys. All right, I'm gonna go, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, no, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm sorry to run out. Friday night, I'll come back.
Yes,
I'll
for
come
sure.
back.
You're
Yeah.
so local. We're gonna have. Thank you so much.
I agree with you.
Maybe someone should walk.
Well,
That's it.